Hi, I'm Rick Landman, and for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to be sharing stories about my life as a gay son of two Jewish German Holocaust survivors, refugees, baby boomer who grew up in New York City, and at the end, I hope you'll understand where some of my beliefs come from. Now, the first question people always ask me, when did you first realize that you were gay? Here's a picture of me shortly after my mother's obstetrician, Dr. Emil Masbacher, delivered me, and I was wondering, why did that man slap me on my tushy? My parents brought me home to this block in eastern Queens, which basically looks the same now as it did back then. But there was something different about our block. Again, this is before Brown versus Board of Education. This is at a time when separate but equal was the law of the land, including in New York City. This was the Jewish block, and a synagogue was built at the corner, and everyone on our block was Jewish. But my family was a little bit different, where everyone else on the block's grandparents had a Yiddish accent and spoke with a Yiddish accent that everything was so beautiful or so good. In my family, it was my father who had the accent. My father had a German Jewish accent, sounded much more like this here. Our family, my mom and my dad, and three of my grandparents were all born in Germany. The other thing you should realize for the younger generation, housing was subsidized back then. The federal government had a GI Bill for all of the soldiers and their families to be able to buy a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house like this for $13,000 with practically no money down and a very low mortgage. This was the block that I grew up in. My mom is now the last one on the block who lives there of the original owners, and the synagogue I just heard last week that I went to and I was valedictorian of has been closed. Now, here I am in my lederhosen with my brother and my mother and my grandmother. And you'll be able to see there's a cable that's going in the background. This is taken at Bel Air ski area on the German Jewish side of the Catskill Mountains. Yes, Route 28, where Christian Germans owned hotels and where German Jewish refugees went to places like Fleischmann's and Pine Hill and Phoenicia and Woodstock, was different than the Borscht Belt on Route 17 with hotels like the Concord and the Nevele, where they spoke Yiddish and ate Yiddish Jewish type of foods. In our area of the Catskills, they spoke German, and we all ate German food. Now, here I am at the age of 7, coming out of the swimming pool at the Pine Hill Arms. It's hard to see from your perspective, but it says, "I love Grandma" on my bathing suit, and my grandma was the one with a brownie taking a picture of me that day. Here I am in my 6th grade class, and as usual, I'm in the front row because I am one of the shortest in the class. That will become a family tradition on my mother's side of the family. We were all very short. The other thing you can realize, and this was in 1963, the year John F. Kennedy was shot. In my 6th grade class, the students who would stay with me all the way through high school, everyone was pale. We were the Catholic, Irish Catholics, Irish Italian Catholics, and Jews. In my neighborhood, there were very few Protestants, and there were very few people of darker skin shades. We were growing up in a restricted world, where the word restricted meant no Jews, no Catholics, and no one with darker skin allowed. Here, in short, is where America had its separate but equal tradition. It started with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And then after I was born, the Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court started to remove segregation from schooling. And then in the 60s, we began fighting for equal rights in housing, employment, and public accommodation, regardless of one's religion. But sexual orientation and gender identity was nowhere on the screen. At that point in time, openly LGBT people were considered mentally ill and were criminals. Now what I'd like to do is go and explain a little bit of my family background. And I'm starting on my father's side of the family. This is my father's father, Joseph, and his wife, Regina. And these two people, Gershon and Sophie Landmann, they grew up in the area of now Ukraine, at that time the border between the Austro-Hungarian Empire of Galicia and Russia. Sadly, almost everyone on this photograph died during the Holocaust. A few of them had children who were able to get out in the Kindertransport. And since these pictures, the people are still young, when the spouses of these people married, they also died during the Holocaust. Minna, my father's cousin, my father's aunt, Tante Minna, she was first enslaved when the rest of the family got a visa to come to America in 1939, until she finally was deported to Auschwitz for her extermination. The rest of the family, only my grandfather's brother and daughter were also enslaved in the Riga labor camp, and the rest of them died in Auschwitz. My two great-grandparents, who were Hasidic, he was a Hasidic scholar from Husiaten who went to Munich in 1900. He would die in 1942 with his wife in Theresienstadt. No one in my family survived after 1942. And this is the nuclear family. This is my grandfather, my grandmother, my father, and the two sisters. My father and my grandfather were both arrested after Kristallnacht and went to Dachau. Daddy was just 18. My grandfather was able to get out and get a visa to America under the quota because they considered him a Russian and not a Polish person living in Germany. Then my father was able to get released to go to London as a unaccompanied teenager at 18, speaking no English, but he was able to go to London and wait until America would give him a visa to join the rest of the family. And my grandmother and my two aunts, they were able to get out in 1939 in the summertime, and by Thanksgiving Day of 1939, my father got out of London and got to New York, and the family was together. This is the piece of paper that saved my family's life. This is when my grandfather Joseph first went to the U.S. consulate, and he thought he was a Polish Jew living in Germany, and his number under the quota was 1,545. They said, come back in 3 to 5 years. He then found out, because his birth certificate was in Russian, that his town that he was born in was Russian and not part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they added him to the person who helped him discover this, who was number 56, gave him 56A, and he went to America. This is the piece of paper that proved that my father was in Dachau after Kristallnacht. His mother would send money, like to a canteen, thinking that it was going to my father. But of course the Nazis kept all of that money, and the inmates in Dachau never saw it. Now my father gets out of Germany to London to the United States. When the war breaks out, my father joins the U.S. Army, goes across the North Africa with Audie Murphy's group, to Sicily, up through Italy, through the Anzio breakout, to France, and then to Germany. And my father is there on the day they liberate Dachau. And my father was told by Colonel Porter he could go to Augsburg, his hometown, to see if anyone in his family was alive. All the Jews were deported from Augsburg by 1942 and were killed. But my father's army uniform is in the Jewish Museum in Augsburg, along with other artifacts from my father, in that they attribute him to be the first American soldier to enter Augsburg right before the liberation. Now here is my mother and her parents, my grandma and my grandpa, my father, and my grandma and my grandpa on my father's side. Now, my mother's side of the family lived in Germany for generations. My grandfather can trace his family back to 1585 in Talmasig. My grandfather even fought in World War I for the Kaiser and was a very proud German, was very happy that Jews became full citizens in 1871, and was very proud of the Weimar Republic that my grandfather grew up in. He kicked Julius Streicher in the tuchus when, after World War I, he moved to Nuremberg, where he met my grandmother and my mother was born. Julius Streicher was the head propagandist in Nuremberg, the publisher of Der Stürmer. And because he kicked him in the tuchus, on the day Dachau opened, my grandpa was on the list on March 23rd of 33 to be sent to Dachau. But he was tipped off. So when he saw the brown shirts coming up the street, he fled at lunchtime, went to the train station, and went to France. And then my grandmother and my mother followed him. So as a result, that side of the family, practically no one died. They got to Strasbourg in 33, and then in 39, when they saw the synagogues being burnt across the river in Germany, they applied for a visa, and because my grandmother's uncle had a restaurant in downtown Manhattan, Ye Old Shop House, they got a visa to come to America. By pure coincidence, I will spend 20 years of my life at NYU overseeing the real estate where my great-grandfather's brother had his restaurant. I also found out that my great-grandfather's sister was Helena Kramer, who was a friend of Bertha Pappenheim and is very famous in her own right. She helped run the orphanage in Germany. She tried to save the Jewish children. She was able to get out through Portugal, from France to Portugal, to Cuba in 1940. So she was able to get to New York City and survived. Unfortunately, the children in the orphanage did not. Other thing I want to say is, this is my parents' wedding picture. As good Bavarians, they wanted to go skiing in Stowe for their honeymoon. But again, if there was a sign that said restricted in front of the hotel, it also included Jews. So my parents couldn't find a place to stay. They finally found a tiny bread and breakfast called the Sleepers that allowed a openly Jewish person to stay there. My father could have lied. He had blue eyes. He had, he had German-looking characteristics, and he could have said he was a German, but he said he was Jewish, and as a result, they had very few places to be able to stay. This here is a picture of my grandfather. Again, one of the shortest in the beginning, and this is his picture in his army group in World War I. So I just want to share a little bit of my anxiety. Just as the Jews fought for years to get full citizenship when living in Germany and achieved it in 1871, they lost it all when Hitler came to power, and when Hitler was able to change the legislature and the courts and create the Nuremberg laws, which took away all of the citizenship of Jews living in Germany, turned them into foreign aliens living in a strange land, and also removed the marriage laws that now declared that an Aryan could not be married to a Jew. So we in America went through this anti-immigration feeling back in the first America First movement. And in 1924, it was when we changed the immigration laws to try to go back to a quota system to make us look like we were in the census of 1890, when pale-skinned Anglo-Saxon Protestants were the ones who were in charge. So that is why so many of the German and Austrian Jews who tried to get out in 1939 were not allowed to come to the United States, and why people like me are nervous that just as a democracy was able to be ended in 1933, and within 2 years everyone's rights were taken away who were Jewish, I am also nervous that in our country we have to fight to make sure that our courts and legislature do not roll back on the civil rights that people have obtained since the 1960s. So now we'll go to my life again. This picture is not Leave It to Beaver, but this is my family, my father, my mother, my older brother, and me. And we had a very similar situation to Leave It to Beaver. I was the beaver. This picture is taken in my living room in the house that my mom still lives in. This is me at 13, at a picture from my Bar Mitzvah. And in 1965, it was a very pivotal year for me. In my Hebrew school class, we were learning how boys and girls got married. And my Hebrew school teacher would pick a taller boy and a shorter girl, a taller boy and a shorter girl. And he would make couples around the room with a paper cup. When he got to me, he said, there are no girls shorter than you. You just look at what everyone else is doing, and when you get married, you'll do the same thing. The only thing is I was thinking, ooh, I don't want to marry a girl. So I raised my hand and said, is there a ritual, a bracha, something, for two boys to get married? I got yelled at so much during that day that even though I was going to be valedictorian later on in June, and I was supposed to donate a Torah that my mother's father, Opa, brought to America, things were going through my mind that was saying, one day there'll be a gay-friendly synagogue, and I'm going to get married and go there. Later on that summer, I was bar mitzvahed on June 26th, which was the last Shabbat in June, which 4 years later will be the Stonewall Rebellion. So in a way, I had it tipped off that it was a very special day at the end of June for me. And then in July, I told my camp counselor in my Jewish summer camp in Fleischmann's that I had a crush on Wayne, whereupon he told me never tell anybody, but to this day, Wayne and I are still friends. He called me for my birthday this week, and I will be calling him on his birthday next week. So I graduate from high school at the age of 16, and I go to the State University of New York at Buffalo when I turn 17. The ID card is a little bit off, but this is a picture of me graduating high school in 1969. This picture of the ID card is a few years later, but that's sort of what I look like. The other thing I want the next generation to know is at that time, our society valued education. Everyone who graduated from New York City could go to a city college for free for 4 years. If you got a Regent scholarship, as I did, you could go to any state university for free for 4 years. I chose Buffalo because of the war in Vietnam, and I was nervous that if I had to flee because of the draft, I would go to Canada, which was just right across the bridge. So, at the age of 17, we did have the Mattachine Society in Buffalo under Jim Zeiss. We did have radical lesbians under Madeline Davis. But there was no gay liberation front like there was in Manhattan. So, at a meeting that I was at, or actually I was just at my neighbor's, Madeline said to me, "You can't stay here. Why don't you start your own group?" So I went to the Student Association and I started the Gay Liberation Front at the University of Buffalo in the spring semester of 1970. I filled out all the forms. I got $800 and a room, but I had no members. So before we became official, I put a table up at the student union that said Gay Liberation Front, and people would sign up, and eventually I got a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer, and we had our Gay Liberation Front started. And then that June, when my first year of college was over and I came back to New York City for a summer break, I heard about the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall demonstration. So I went and I marched up 6th Avenue. I found the group of Gay Liberation Front people from Manhattan. I explained to them I was sort of like their cousin since I started a group in Buffalo, and I'd marched along part of the way with the GLF on that first Pride March in 1970. Later, in 71, we had the first march on Albany for gay rights, and my group, along with Mattachine from Buffalo, went to Albany. We were fighting to repeal the sodomy laws because we were still criminals. We fought to repeal the cross-dressing laws, which was being used against the transgender community, although it wasn't called that at the time. And at that time, all openly gay people who were, proud of being gay were considered mentally ill. We couldn't be teachers, and I got my master's in education, and I got a job, and then I was told if I took the job, they would lose the funding. They didn't want an openly gay person there. So I also was thinking of being an attorney at that time, but because of the criminality of the sodomy laws, you were promoting criminality, and there was a moral turpitude clause that was saying that gay activists were against the morals of the Bar Association since we were promoting criminality. By the way, this is the actual poster. You can actually see the holes at the end in the corner that I hung over my bed in Buffalo. I still have this original poster. So this is the poster of the UB founder of the Gay Liberation Front. Now, I graduate from Buffalo with 2 masters. I had a master's in education, but then when I couldn't teach, I went into engineering, and I got my second master's from civil engineering. And I started the College of Urban Studies in Buffalo using my knowledge from my Master's of Education. But then I went to Rutgers and for my third master's degree in City and Regional Planning. And while at Rutgers, the one gay bar was Manny's Den. And I got to know Dick Mack, who was the son of Emmanuel, or Manny, who was running the bar. He was a bit older than me, but we became friends. We lived near each other, and he even used his backyard for my graduation when I graduated in 1977 from Rutgers. He told me the story of how in the 60s, just like in New York, the liquor authorities was closing down bars if they allowed known homosexuals to congregate. Now, Manny's Den and a few others joined together and they fought it. And the Mattachine Society also signed an amicus brief. So I do not know the relationship between the New Jersey and the New York Mattachine Society, but around the same time of the sit-in at Julius, where the lawyer was Enid Gerling and she got Julius's reopened, the lawyer in New Jersey was Theodore Meth, M-E-T-H. And that lawyer went to the constitutionality of saying that homosexuality is not immoral, and therefore we do not come under the definition of immoral people. And therefore Manny's Den got to be able to stay open, and the Supreme Court of New Jersey in 1967 ruled that. And that was 2 years ahead of Stonewall in New York City. Now, while I was at Rutgers, Johnson & Johnson and the city of New Brunswick decided to use eminent domain and take over the whole block where Manny's Den was located, knock it down. So the owner, Dick Mack, purchased a property on Georgia Street. My professor, who then became the dean of the planning department at Rutgers and who is retiring this next month actually, he did the rendering of what was going to be a 2-story, very fancy and nice gay bar that in the daytime was a restaurant and in the evening was a gay bar. But the city of New Brunswick would not allow it to have its liquor license moved. So they wanted to clear out any gay bar in New Brunswick. Dick's children opened up a bar called The Den in Somerset, New Jersey. And to this day, I don't think New Brunswick even has a gay bar. So now I graduate from Rutgers. I come back to New York City. It's very hard for me to find a job, even though I have 3 master's degrees, being so openly gay. I took a job with the city of New York, and in 1979, we decide that we would like to know if we could have a march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. Several of us in New York start pushing for it. We use my synagogue space to hold the community meeting. We vote that on October 14th of 1979 we're going to march. At that time, the national groups like National Gay Task Force was not in favor of it. And from the bottom up, as a grassroots movement, we did put together and have the first march on Washington in 1979. And I was one of the 4 New York organizers for that march. Here we are. I think it's the 25th anniversary of the first March on Washington. Sadly, Dick Radvin has passed, Ron Alheim has passed, and she was holding the certificate for Betty Santoro, who was not feeling well that day. She too has passed. So it is ironic when they say October is LGBT History Month and Coming Out Day is on the 12th. That's from the second march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights, which was chosen to coincide with the same weekend as the first march on Washington. But very few people remember that there was a first march. The second march was larger, and that's the march that most people remember. Then, around that time, I get promoted in the city, and I become one of the youngest executive directors of a city agency. And Mayor Koch at the time, who was not an openly gay person, he created the New York City Holocaust Memorial Park in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. They originally were going to have stone markers for the other victims, but when they found out one of them was going to be for the homosexual community, there was an uproar. It took about 20 years. I finally got a stone inscribed for the 5 of the other victim groups, including the homosexual community. Here is a picture of me. And I'm going to hope that next year, I think it's the 15th anniversary, I'm going to try to see if this mayor's administration will hold an official unveiling. I had an unofficial unveiling with death threats and with people demonstrating against it. But I'm hoping that's one of my goals that I'm going to try to do for next year. Other things, that Torah that my grandpa brought to America that I was supposed to donate at my Bar Mitzvah that I refused. Well, in 1973, when CBST, Congregation Bet Simchas Torah, opened, my mother said, "Remember, you said there'd be a gay synagogue? I said you were nuts. Here's a little article about it. Get dressed and go to shul." So I am one of the longest running members at CBST. I brought the Torah to CBST where it was there for many years until I heard a rabbi came from Germany and spoke at our synagogue about how he was about to be outed. And he started a progressive synagogue in Munich. I said to him, "Would you want a 200-year-old Torah that survived the Holocaust?" So I brought it there on Shavuos, my birthday, in 2005. He is now the dean of the Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin. And my Torah is still at Congregation Beth Shalom. A little side note, I went there with my speech in English. I didn't know that I spoke German, but I knew I understood it. But the night of my birthday, I had a little bit too much to drink. Something happened in my brain, and German started coming out of my mouth. So when I came home, I said to my father, "Do you know I speak German?" My father said, "Ricky, you remember your Opa?" So I said, "Sure." He goes, "You remember going to Washington Heights?" I said, "Sure." He goes, "Opa didn't speak English, and neither did anyone else in Washington Heights." So ich kann wie ein Fünfjähriger. I can speak like a 5-year-old German. I know simple words, and I'm able to at least converse. And they asked me to give my sermon, my speech, for Shavuos and for dedicating the Torah in German, and I was able to do it. Another story I just want to give to you about my father. So right when I was going to Albany in 71, I had to tell my parents I might get arrested, I might get tear gassed, I might get my picture in the paper, because remember, my generation, I went to the anti-Vietnam marches in 1969 in Washington. So when I told this to my family right before going to Albany, my father said, "Ricky, let me tell you something. When I was your age, I would walk down the street and the kids would want to beat me up. I'd ask my mother, what the hell did the Jews do? Why do they hate us so much? My mother told me, we did nothing wrong. The whole world is crazy. The doctors, the political people, the lawyers, the police, everyone said we're horrible people. We're not. But we have to love ourselves and be proud of ourselves. And Ricky, I say the same to you about the homosexuals. There's nothing wrong. This is you, and I want you to know your mother and your father, we love you." And I look back and I say, how at the age of 17 did I have the courage and strength to do what I did? And I think it's because I had the support of my parents back in the 60s to give me the support to know that they would love me unconditionally. So after coming back from Munich, I really started exploring my roots and myself and my family. And the legislature in Germany had passed a law that if your parents were German Jews and lost their citizenship because of the Nuremberg laws, you don't apply for it. You just reinstate your right to be a German, and they send you a passport. Now, around that time, in my synagogue, we were trying to help LGBT asylum seekers, and it was so difficult to fill out like 13 pages for an I-589 form to be able to try to get asylum. I filled out these forms in pencil, 3 pages, and I got approved. So I am now technically a dual citizen of Germany and of America. So what I tried to do at first, I tried to have a Jewish contingent to march in the Von Steuben Day parade. But I couldn't get any other Jews to walk with me, so some years I would walk by myself. Then, realizing that von Steuben was known to be, using the word today, gay, to George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, I applied for a LGBT contingent to march in the Steuben Day parade. We had up to about 17 people at one time. I might try again to do it this year, but at least they couldn't stop us, considering that von Steuben, he wasn't German, he was Prussian, he wasn't gay. I don't know what the name was back then. So I also want to focus, I did go back to law school in the 1980s once sodomy laws were decriminalized in New York State, which was the Onofre decision in 1980. So I want to also mention how much the lawyers helped in our movement. Yes, Stonewall was a pivotal catalyst to our movement, but also back then, besides, being able to, let me look at it this way. Okay, to be able to get rid of the cross-dressing laws, to get rid of the sodomy laws, to be able to, in states, have protections in housing, public accommodations, and employment. We still don't have it at the federal level. We're still trying to get the Equality Act that I first heard mentioned from Bella Abzug in Albany in 1971. We're trying to get that finally approved. We couldn't even have an LGBT not-for-profit 501c3 at that time, or even use the word lesbian and gay in our names. That's why things were called the Human Rights Campaign, or Lambda Legal, or the Bar Association of Human Rights of Greater New York. We couldn't have even a legal defense fund. They were saying that's like Bank Robbers of America legal defense fund. And again, later we were focusing on marriage and being able to be serving in the military. So I just basically want to conclude that my rabbi always says, no person can do everything, but everyone can do something. And I just want to give a corollary of that. The corollary is, over a lifetime, one person can accomplish an awful lot. So when I look at my own life, and I have published the first part of my memoir called The Book of Rick, which does focus on my family background and on my life up until 9/11. Yes, I live 1,000 feet from the World Trade Center, and I had to deal with 9/11. That's in the second book. So I just want to now put this together. My technology is not that good. I don't know how to split a screen and have PowerPoint on one side and me talking. So I am actually talking into my laptop and looking at my desktop. But my goal is, I don't know where this is going, but I want to use my degree in curriculum development to put together some shorter modules based on this overview that I am giving you today, to focus on how racism, how homophobia have affected my life. Remember, in my family, they were murdered and enslaved 10 years before I was born because of these artificial constructs of Aryans and Semites. All of this stuff of subhuman and different races was not true then, and it is not true now. And I also want to be able to focus on so many of the false binaries that I grew up with. And so, as a result, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but everyone said, well, just do it. So I have done it. This is my first video that I've put together on the topic. And it's only 37 minutes. Thank you. Goodbye.